Good evening, everyone. I'm President Tony Monaco, and it's my privilege to welcome you all virtually to this Tufts University event examining the 2020 election. On the heels of an election season like no other, which brought Americans out to vote in record numbers and in new ways, all in the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is much to cover. And so tonight we will look back and look forward. We will discuss the trends and factors that led to the victory of the President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. And we will consider the implications for public policy in critical areas such as foreign affairs, climate justice, and healthcare. For this conversation, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts from across Tufts. Newhouse Professor of Civic Studies Brian Schaffner, Circle Director Dr. Kawashima-Ginsberg, Professor Amy Lischko of the School of Medicine, Dean Bhaskar Chakravorti from the Fletcher School, and our moderator, Dean of the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, Alan Solomont. Before I hand things over to Dean Solomont, let me say a few words about our students and the whole Tufts community. As 2020 comes to a close, we continue to be so proud of the way our students, faculty, and staff have persevered safely and with great resiliency during the pandemic. By following carefully constructed protocols, they have demonstrated a level of care for each other and our institution that has allowed us to move through this very different and challenging semester together. Through Tisch College and our nonpartisan Jumbo Vote initiative, students across our campuses safely engaged their peers throughout the election season, registering thousands of students to vote and sharing vital information about vote by mail and other election procedures. As we come together tonight, we do not know what will come next. The nation is still in the throes of an awful, uncontrolled pandemic. But our students and young people across the country and around the world fill me with hope for a more inclusive, stronger, and more equitable future. I have seen how they fight for what they believe in, how they hold those in power accountable, and how they take care of one another. And so, as we consider the election of 2020, I hope we will remember the power and leadership of this young generation. Again, I thank you for being with us and for your ongoing support of Tufts. And I gladly turn the event over to our esteemed moderator, Dean Alan Solomont. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you for your wise leadership of our university during this unprecedented year and for your enthusiastic support of Tufts students' political engagement. It's a privilege for me to moderate this conversation with colleagues I'll introduce momentarily. They are not just experts at Tufts, but nationally recognized authorities on polling, youth voting, international affairs, and healthcare policy. For Tisch College, today's event is a fitting conclusion to a busy, challenging, but ultimately impactful semester. In a year when everything seems to be different, the mission of Tisch College has remained the same: to prepare Tufts students to lead active civic lives, and to promote and strengthen civic and political engagement on campus and around the country. The work takes many forms, but in an election year, we focus heavily on political engagement by studying and supporting the participation of young people in democracy, both on the Tufts campus and across the country. President Monaco mentioned the exceptional work of Jumbo Vote, and I could not agree more. A student-led effort supported by Tisch College, Jumbo Vote adapted to every challenge posed by the pandemic. And I have no doubt that as a result, voter participation at Tufts increased. We will learn exactly how Tufts students turned out to vote this election, thanks to Tisch College's Institute for Democracy and Higher Education, or IDHE. IDHE conducts the only nationwide study of college student voting, providing over 1,100 colleges and universities with detailed reports on their students' electoral participation and disseminating best practices throughout all of higher education about how to increase political learning and engagement on campus. Another of Tisch College's research enterprises is CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. CIRCLE produces the nation's most influential research on youth civic and political participation, and focuses especially on how to close equity gaps and empower marginalized young people to vote and to participate in civic life. In a few minutes, you'll hear from CIRCLE's director, Dr. Kawashima-Ginsberg, about how young people made their voices heard, profoundly influencing the outcome of the 2020 election. Tisch College does this work because we believe that communities and our democracy thrive when young people participate. I hope you'll follow our work and visit our website, tischcollege.tufts.edu, to learn more and to engage with us and support us. Now let me briefly introduce tonight's four panelists, all of whom deserve far lengthier introductions than time permits, and each of whom brings deep expertise and a unique perspective to questions about what happened in the 2020 election and what the future holds. Bhaskar Chakravorti is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School and the founding executive director of Fletcher's Institute for Business in the Global Context. He serves as professor of the practice of international business, and he recently launched a multi-year initiative, Imagining a Digital Economy for All, which investigates the role of data, digital technologies, and artificial intelligence in driving economic growth, development, and productivity. As I mentioned, we are also joined by my colleague, Dr. Kawashima-Ginsberg, Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tisch College. A clinical psychologist by training, Kay is one of the nation's leading experts on the civic engagement of young people, on youth voting, and on healthy youth development. She is the author of several landmark reports on civic education and serves on the national boards of Generation Citizen and Democracy Works, as well as on the advisory boards of Nonprofit Vote and the American Bar Association's Division of Public Education. She is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, which just issued its report, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. Amy Lischko is an associate professor of public health and community medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine. Before coming to Tufts, she served for over a decade in senior positions in Massachusetts state government, including as Commissioner of Healthcare Finance and Policy and the Director of Healthcare Policy in the administration of former Governor Mitt Romney. In that role, Amy helped lead the restructuring of the Commonwealth's healthcare system. She is a much sought after expert, consultant, and speaker on healthcare reform. And last but certainly not least, I'm pleased to introduce another Tisch College colleague, Professor Brian Schaffner, the Newhouse Professor of Civic Studies at Tisch College and in the Tufts Political Science Department. Brian's research focuses on public opinion, campaigns and elections, political parties, and legislative politics. He is the co-principal investigator on the Congressional Election Study, a federally sponsored survey of over 50,000 Americans that is widely used by political scientists and other researchers. Before coming to Tufts, Brian was a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a faculty associate at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. We have assembled an all-star team of Tufts University talent, and I am eager to get the conversation going. I will begin with a question for all of our panelists and then ask each of them a follow-up question or two. Later in the program, we will move to audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it at any time during the panel discussion via the chat box to the right of your screen. Lastly, you'll see some activity from time to time in the chat box. We have a few audience polls we will be conducting to help you reflect on the 2020 election. Please check these out if you'd like to participate. So now let me ask all panelists a question, and I'll start with Kawashima-Ginsberg. The 2020 election was billed as the most important in a generation, and it was certainly the most unusual. I know each of you could reflect on the outcome all evening, but please summarize in just a few minutes, what are your big takeaways from the 2020 election? Kay, we'll start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me tonight. It's such an honor to be here, and it's really wonderful to reflect on what happened so far. It was indeed an unusual year, and I'll try to limit myself to maybe 2 or 3 points. One is that the young people's participation definitely increased in a notable way. Regardless of what methodology we use to measure exact turnout, which is still to be seen, young people's participation was really pivotal in determining the outcome of some key swing states. And that's because the young people showed up in large numbers. It made a really decisive choice toward Democratic candidates across the board. And that was really significant in continuation of trends that we started to see in 2018. This turnout, at least keeping up with an overall increase with the general electorate, was really significant because over the summer and in the spring, we were starting to see really, really challenging barriers to young people who want to participate, but face a lot of barriers. To name a few, those are things like young people tend to move a lot more often. And so updating addresses for voter registration, for example, is an added burden. And whenever unemployment goes higher and higher, young people are the first to be let go. So those things really threw a lot of uncertainties in young people's life. And of course, those of us who work in universities and connected to schools in K-12 settings know our educational settings were turned upside down. And a lot of times young people who were just starting to think about election as 18, 19, 20-year-old hear about election for the first time at the school cafeteria from their friends, from their professors who make passionate plea about voting in election. Those things did not happen in person for the most part. Instead, they heard from professors over Zoom, they got text messages, and they got social media messages. And those really threw a lot of uncertainty. And of course, a lot of young people had never voted by mail. So of course, I applaud the efforts made and laws changed to make mail voting easier, but there were a lot of young people who were just having no idea how to do that early in the cycle. So having that information communicated to young people and preparing earlier and earlier, thanks to many activists and many organizations that work alongside us, I think was a really significant win for the sector, not just in terms of who won. That doesn't really concern me so much as how the communities came together to make sure that everybody had access to vote. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, you wrote a great deal about what Americans were thinking about the candidates. You were also talked to 50,000 Americans. What are your big takeaways from the 2020 election?
Yeah, you know, there's a kind of obviously a lot of takeaways. I think to think about how we think about the 2020 election, we kind of have to go back to 2016 and think about sort of where that left us and maybe think about how far have we come or how far have we not come since then. And, you know, after the 2016 election, I, along with several other political scientists, wrote and found with various data sources that attitudes like racism and sexism and xenophobia were as strong a predictor of the presidential vote choice in 2016 as they had been in any recent elections before that. And so I think a lot of people came into 2020 thinking about, you know, what that would mean for this election. And, you know, this had a lot of, this affected things in a lot of ways. Partly it affected the way the Democrats thought about who they would nominate. And, you know, they settled on a candidate, I think, who they thought could appeal to a wide variety of individuals, even those who may not be who may not have been supporters of Clinton in 2016. And there was, I think, a lot of logic and purpose behind that. And Biden ran a campaign that was designed to, restore honor and integrity to the White House. Again, a lot of this campaign came down to issues of identity, just as it had in 2016. And so when you look at the outcome of the 2020 election, you do see some movement, and you see that, okay, Biden did do better than Clinton. And, maybe that suggests that there's been some progress on these really inherent issues. But at the same time, I think a lot of people were maybe expecting or even hoping that there would be an even bigger Biden victory, which would be sort of a renunciation of sort of the politics of racism and sexism that Trump had been running on for 4 years, and that didn't really happen. I think we had another very close election, somewhat less close in 2016, but still close. And I think what that actually reflects is that we're still an extremely divided country, and we're very much divided on these issues of identity. And these issues of identity tend to override almost everything else. And you think about an incumbent president running for re-election during an unprecedented pandemic and, during economic uncertainty. And, the fact that it was still so close, despite all of these things, despite the controversies that surrounded the Trump White House for 4 years and everything else, I think really reflects how deeply divided we are as a country, and is in some ways maybe, at least as unsettling as the 2016 election was for many of us who are sort of watching American politics. And I think, one of my takeaways in this election is that, we are maybe making slow progress as a country, but at the same time, we're still deeply, deeply divided on these fundamental issues of racial equality, gender equality, issues around identity that still very much divide us. And, even when we have such an unprecedented election with so many unprecedented events happening, very few people were moved, and we ended the 2020 election not that different than we ended the 2016 election, and we're still very divided.
Well, I know both Brian and Kay are poring over data and polling information to learn even more about what happened, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. But let me ask Amy, talk about issues that divide us. Healthcare is certainly one of them, and how the COVID pandemic was being handled is certainly part of that. What's your big takeaway, especially from a healthcare standpoint, Amy?
Yeah, so I agree with Brian wholeheartedly about how one of my big takeaways is how divided we are as a nation. And I think from the beginning of the election cycle, where we were in the primaries, healthcare was certainly a big issue, where we were debating issues of single payer versus keeping the ACA and just making incremental changes versus, knocking the ACA out altogether. And I think people came out to vote in the election due to healthcare as well. No longer this issue of healthcare for all, but now it's COVID. And I think certainly it's more the Democrats that came out to vote with healthcare as their primary reason, but even Republicans coming out to vote because of the relationship between their number one issue, which is the economy, and COVID. I think we'll have to see what happens in Georgia. Our election isn't really over yet, and those 2 Senate seats will be important for health policy for sure, and other domestic issues. But I think even if the Democrats win in Georgia, there is this, there's just not a mandate, I think, for big changes given what happened in the election. And I'm not sure what that's going to mean for health policy, but I think that it's going to mean more incremental as opposed to some of these bigger ideas that President-elect Biden has talked about. And we'll look to some issues that are also important, but maybe where some bipartisan support can really come about.
Thank you. Bhaskar, one of the ironies about presidential elections is probably one of the most important parts of the job of president is to represent the United States in the community of nations. And yet foreign policy plays a lesser role in presidential elections. On the other hand, if there is likely to be a change, it might be in the area of foreign policy. So what are your takeaways, especially looking at the situation with a global lens?
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to join this distinguished group here, Alan. And I'm really looking forward to learning from all my colleagues and from the questions from the audience. You're absolutely right. We are going to be making so many turns in terms of policy, both domestic and foreign. And Joe Biden comes with a long track record in the arena of foreign policy. He's somebody who's been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades. He's been a chair of the committee. He's been a representative for President Obama in many parts of the world. And here is a man who is the ultimate committee man. He is an ultimate kind of a multilateralist. He likes to press people's shoulders, lean close to their face, and tries to get them to see his perspective, and even if their perspective is very different from his. So he tries to get people together in a room in order to find solutions to problems, even if the solution is non-existent. And I see that being, perhaps the almost a metaphor for foreign policy for Joe Biden as we look ahead, whether that foreign policy is directed at China or an Iran or North Korea or our allies across the Atlantic in Europe, or thinking about rising Asia, or parts of the world on which the United States has had a bit of a flip-flop in terms of foreign policy, whether that is in the Middle East or South Asia. In each one of these cases, I see multilateralism, taking a committee approach. And of course, I'm talking to a former ambassador, so you may have more to share in terms of how you see foreign policy play out in this new administration. But I see a turning away from America first and towards American leadership at a table where others are also not necessarily equal partners, but potentially different hierarchies of partners. And this is where I think there's some additional discussion to be had as to whether America still owns that leadership position, or whether it should just be just a common player along with others, because there are powers that have now risen to a stature that didn't exist before.
There certainly is a robust debate going on as to whether the United States is going to be restored to that position of leadership, and certainly in our allies in Europe are having that conversation. I suppose you would never accuse the current president of being a committee man either. In any event, let me move on to ask each of you individual questions, if I may. And I think people are right that this country is divided. One of the groups that may be less divided than others is young people. Thanks to Circle's research, we know that young people did turn out to vote at higher rates than ever before. And according to the estimates of Circle, and 52 to 55% of eligible young people voted in this election. They made a big difference in battleground states, including Georgia, but also Arizona and Michigan and Pennsylvania. So I'd like to ask Kay, who spends most of her days and a good deal of her nights looking at this, what do you attribute the turnout of young people? Would you say that they are less divided than the rest of the country? And how do we sustain or even grow this level of youth political engagement, which I hope we all think is a good thing?
Thanks for that. I wish we had all night to talk about that, because there's so much into that question. I would say, though, young people aren't necessarily not polarized, but I do think young people, especially in these last couple cycles, succeeded in coming together over really large priority in their case, it was knocking President Trump out of the office. It was really important for a lot of movement leaders. And though they have different priorities, they're able to actually organize well enough to come together. So there's an incredible show of skill and maturity, especially for their young age. In terms of actual voting for offices, they continue to be about 60 to 40% kind of break in terms of their preference toward Democrats. So they're not quite the sort of half and half split the rest of the United States or the opposite split the senior citizen might have. But they do still disagree. The truth that's really difficult to swallow about young people today is that though it is the most diverse and intersectional population, they've also grown up in schools and neighborhoods that are more segregated economically and sometimes racially than young people did in the 80s and even 90s. And that's part result of the economic inequality that's increasing in this country and the choices the parents make increasingly about where their children go to school and how they grow up and what kind of values they develop. The pandemic really surfaced even more of these inequalities and how separate the lives can be and what kind of schooling experience the school children are having today is just one sign of that. So it's a little bit more nuanced. I think what I'm seeing is that they are so politically precocious, if you will, that they start to organize in their early teens. So by the time they're turning into 18, 19-year-old, many leaders are able to really make that kind of shift and think about short-term goals in a really long game. And remember, they're just 20 or so. So they have many, many more years of really thinking about those long-term goals. But that connects me to my other thought, which is that I think really important to think about young people as partners rather than levers or some sort of just votes for the next couple cycles, because young people are definitely watching. And I think they can turn in any other way if they use their organizing power to some other priority. And if the president or other leaders that they thought they elected so that they can partner together don't come back with sufficient levels of accountability, young people are ready to take different kinds of action. So I think that's something that is really important to really think about young people as a long-term stakeholders, not just somebody that can elect a Democrat into the office in the next cycle or two. I think you also asked about some of the driving factors. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, thanks to your good work, frankly, elected officials, candidates are really beginning to speak to young people. I hope they will follow that follow-up advice that you give to continue to speak and to listen, actually. Let me move along, if I may. I wanted to ask Brian, who knows about polling, to comment on what appears to have been a great deal of inaccuracy in the polls. We saw this in 2016, and there were some adjustments in the way people conduct polls, but it doesn't seem as though the pollsters necessarily predicted the outcome of the 2020 elections. Now, do you agree with that? And if so, what do you think happened? And should we reevaluate the importance of polls in the future?
Great questions. Definitely questions that I've been grappling with since election night, and frankly been asked of many reporters since election night. And I think there's a few things to say. First, I'll start with I guess what my students would call a humble brag, which is to say that at Tufts, the students in my polling seminar and I this semester conducted our own national survey just before the election, and actually our final vote estimate was 52 for Biden and 45 for Trump, and so it turns out we actually were pretty close to what the ultimate outcome was in terms of the vote share. So and I think
you can brag on that. I think that's brag.
I'm bragging on behalf of my students mostly. So yeah. But I think
I don't mind my bragging on you myself.
Well, and in some ways, sometimes it's useful to take a step back and just think about sort of, all the things that go into doing an election poll that make it so difficult. For example, it's the one kind of polling that we do that we actually don't know the population when we do the poll, right? So like we're trying to do a poll of voters, but people haven't even necessarily voted yet. And so part of, it's not just a matter of getting the right sample, it's also a matter of figuring out who in our sample is actually going to turn out and vote, because everyone claims that they're going to vote, but not everyone does. And then of course, there's just the difficulties of polling these days, which is extremely difficult. 20 years ago, you could reach everyone, every adult American almost, by simply dialing a landline telephone number, and that's just not the case anymore. And so we have all these different new modes of polling, which are great, but no single mode is able to reach everybody. And so it's just much, much more complicated to be a pollster these days. And so in some ways you can step back and say, well, we did this poll a week before the election, and we were basically nailed Biden's vote share, and we were off by a percentage point or two on Trump's. And that's actually pretty remarkable in a lot of ways, given all the challenges that pollsters face. Then again, the national polls were suggesting something more like a Biden, 8 percentage point victory rather than the 5 percentage point victory that we got. And so once again, the polls this year were biased a lot like they were in 2016. And the polls were especially biased in some of the same states where they were also biased in 2016. So like if you look at, for example, the polling that was done in Wisconsin leading up to election day, those polls were suggesting huge Biden blowouts where in fact the outcome was extremely close. And so while the polls more or less got a lot of the sort of the right winner nationally, they picked the right winner, on the margin they're still off. And as a pollster, we have to take a look at that, and because what election, most people who do polling, like myself, like Kay, like others, we're not really in it to like predict election outcomes, but election outcomes are a really good way of sort of a check on how good we're doing at all the things we are polling for. It's telling us something about our sample, and I think it takes a while to figure out what's wrong with the polls. We're gonna, for example, with the survey I run, we will match our respondents to voter files to see which people who told us they were going to vote but didn't vote versus the people who did actually vote. What was it a matter of misidentifying who the likely voters were? Was it that some people changed their minds because we re-interviewed them after the election? But also, I think there's probably going to end up being a bigger story, which is that when you have a candidate like Trump and people who that sort of peddles a message of not trusting institutions like the news media, like institutions of higher learning, I think it can potentially cause problems for pollsters, because it basically means that there is a subset of his supporters who are basically being told, like, don't trust these organizations that do polling. And so those individuals, those particular Trump supporters, may be less likely to answer polls, and it may make it more challenging for us. And so, I think, if that's the case, then it's going to be a challenge for pollsters going forward. When you have maybe a party who's sort of undermining trust in the kinds of institutions who do the polling, then it's going to be much more difficult to get people to respond to the polls. So, we'll see what the issues are. I suspect there is this bigger issue that we're going to have to grapple with, but I don't think we need to throw away polls. I think we need to keep figuring out how to just improve our methods, even in the face of all these challenges that we face as pollsters.
But you believe in the theory of the bashful Trump voter?
I don't. Well, I don't. Yeah, I don't think the Trump voter is lying to me. I just don't think they're taking my survey in the first place. So, our polls weren't just off on Trump. They were off on, Senate races like Susan Collins. Like, nobody's going to lie about not voting for Susan Collins, for example. Like, she's not necessarily a particularly controversial figure. So I don't think people are talking to pollsters and then not admitting that they vote for Trump. I just think that there's potentially a subset of adults in the country who just aren't talking to pollsters at all. And those are the people who are sort of maybe Trump's strongest backers.
Let me just ask Kay quickly, are young people any easier or harder to poll than the general population?
Young people are actually a lot harder to poll than general population, I would argue. They're just much more sophisticated about who they trust and whose call they're willing to take and whose text messages they answer. So it really takes a lot of careful weighting and sampling to even try to figure that out. In fact, we really didn't think we could actually accurately estimate from a survey how many of the young people would vote in the summer. So we just didn't even bother asking because it's that hard.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what we can expect going forward. And Bhaskar, let me get a little more specific about some international issues. So what are the implications of this election for international trade? And what should we expect from a Biden-Harris administration regarding international business, especially in a digital age and in the face of rapidly changing technologies, which is something that you are quite expert in?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Alan. How much time do we have? Because it looks like we are going to be able to only skim over the top of the iceberg on this question. But if I were to, kind of read the crystal ball on this, and I've tried reading practically everything that the Biden team has put out, and going through previous interviews with candidate Biden, and the one phrase that sticks with me is, and it's a useful phrase to carry with us as we go through the holidays and into 2021 and beyond. And that phrase is light on details. Light on details. Practically on every issue, whether it is on international trade, business, how President-elect Biden and the future President Biden is going to look at the digital economy and its role in both in a domestic setting and an international setting, light on details. So this is very much of a watch this space kind of a situation. As one reflects on what would be his stance on trade and the global economy and the data economy, which is increasingly the part that we should be focusing on. The data economy or the digital economy has grown 4 times as fast as the overall American economy. So that is the place to go if you are looking for economic recovery. It is also the growth engine for the world, but certainly the growth engine for America, because if you think about the one sector that has come out strong through 2020, where every other sector has collapsed, it is the digital sector. So it is enormously important for President-elect Biden and his team to wrap their arms around the digital economy and the implications for international business as the American tech companies, the American e-commerce companies, grapple with supply chains and markets and data rules and regulations and kind of the nationalism policies that are kind of popping up all over the world, and the bipolarity that is now developing vis-a-vis China, which is developing its own digital strengths. And there is emerging competition between China and the United States, not necessarily in the traditional area of international trade, of making widgets or manufacturing or cheap labor. Now it is about data and about the digital economy and the future economy that is predicated on emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and 5G. So I've thrown a lot of sort of mumbo jumbo out there, and it turns out that if you interrogate Joe Biden, for him, it's not that he is unfamiliar with technology. It's just that he chooses not to focus on technology as much as he chooses to focus on the bread and butter stuff, which is jobs. And he really is a paradox in terms of being the first US president to be elected almost entirely on the back of technology, having run a campaign that is socially distanced, first time in history. And here is a guy who's not terribly tech savvy and doesn't have the fanatical Twitter following that's de rigueur for modern politicians. His understanding of technology is relatively light. Every time people have asked him about some of the hot button tech issues, it's clear that his response hasn't been particularly well thought out. So I think there is a lot of education that is necessary, and I'm just focusing on the technology part of it, but there is a larger kind of a global business policy that the administration needs to develop. To encapsulate it in one word, I would come back to what I said before: committee. I think he's going to put together a committee internally, and he's going to operate a lot of his international agreements and conversations by committee. In the meantime, there is a committee that is already formed in Asia, the new pact that has just brought together the rising Asian powers with China at the table, has basically taken 1/3 of the global economy into a very powerful common trade zone, and America is not part of it. So Joe Biden will have to figure out how to get there. He'll have to figure out how to get back into the Paris deal. So there are many committees that he needs to return to. That's going to be his first step.
So the United States isn't part of that deal because we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was negotiated by the previous administration. I was going to ask you if the data economy wasn't a significant area of competition between the United States and China. You've already answered that, so let me ask you, which way is Europe going to turn?
Well, it's interesting the role that Europe is playing, because Europe has sort of been in a data recession or a digital recession for a while. It's basically been going downhill in terms of growth in its digital sector, and certainly its innovativeness has stalled. We have just released our study of 90 countries around the world in terms of digital evolution and momentum, and Europe is what I would call digitally mature region of the world, but digital maturity has come with digital arthritis. So things have kind of slowed down there. What Europe has done really well is innovating on regulation. Rules and regulations and issues to do with data privacy and protection, they are setting the standards. It's really important that we get that right. But at the same time, they have kind of lost the edge in terms of creativity and kind of pushing towards new frontiers.
Well, we talk a lot about the future belonging to the young, but you're going to be an expert in a lot of the really important issues that we're going to be facing going forward. But speaking of important issues that we're facing going forward, Amy, preview for us the debate that you think we're going to be having shortly, if not we're having already, on healthcare policy. What changes are really needed, and what changes do you think are possible, and how will the pandemic affect the healthcare policy debate?
Great question, Alan. I wonder whether we'll be able to solve the digital arthritis problem with healthcare. I'm not so sure. I think the big policy debate is going to be, coming from the left of Biden, the push for bigger progressive changes. So things like a public option, which Biden has supported and ran on, HHS, negotiating drug prices, maybe increasing the subsidies that people get and going higher up the income ladder. Those are sort of some of the big ideas that President-elect Biden ran on. But then that's going to be kind of the opposing view is maybe some less flashy policies where maybe you can get more bipartisan support. So things like that are important, like ending surprise billing for people, which is a big issue that there's a lot of bipartisan support to address. Maybe increasing transparency of costs, with which the Trump administration started, but maybe did not go far enough. Fixing Medicare, which is looming to run out of money, at least the hospital insurance piece of it in 2023, 2024, depending on the analysis you look at. But any of these issues you're going to need to work with Congress and try to have cooperation to be able to pass any of it. And we really haven't seen much of that lately. I don't think it means that President-elect Biden ignores some of the bigger issues, some of the big ideas that have been put forth, but maybe instead of doing some of those ideas on a national level, maybe you support states to do those. There are engines of democracy, and they can kind of figure things out at the state level that maybe then could be uplifted to the national level. So I think you don't give up on those big ideas, like even single payer or rate setting for providers, things that are maybe more controversial to do nationally. You can get away with doing those maybe at a state level and try them out. I think in the short term, we're going to see a lot of focus on the pandemic, of course, right? That's going to overshadow these other ideas, at least in the short term, the first 6 months of the administration. We're already seeing a lot of action in this area. President-elect Biden pulling together a COVID-19 advisory board and talking about getting kids back to school in his first 100 days, mask mandates at the federal level in organizations that federal buildings, et cetera. I think we're going to see a lot more at the federal level for coordinating things like PPE and testing and coordinating contact tracers across the country. So a lot of the things that can help us get back to work and back to school and get us functioning again. So I think the focus is going to be on COVID-19. I do think there's an opportunity maybe to use this pandemic, if you will, to maybe rebuild some of the public health infrastructure that's really sorely needed, that has we've shown a light on this now with this pandemic, that we're just woefully unprepared to really address something like this as a nation. And so I think that this is an opportunity to maybe focus on that and use some of our resources, rich resources, to do that work.
Do you think that the disparities that were revealed so starkly by the pandemic are likely to be addressed, which haven't really been addressed? As, you know, I think the COVID pandemic has really shown us that. Do you think that that's likely possible?
At a legislative level, it's hard to say. We'll have to see. But I certainly think there's lots of things you can do through the administration, through executive orders, and through regulations and policies. So I do think there's a lot on that front that can be done. There's particularly huge problems around Black maternal mortality that have been increasing over time. Those are really important issues. I'm not sure you need legislation, but I think there's lots of work you could do with executive orders and your administration, an administration that is supportive of moving in that direction.
I think your point about looking to states as being places where that may innovate speaks to your own experience, since you had so much to do with reforming the healthcare system in Massachusetts and introducing the kind of reforms that we seem to be having, that seem to be so contentious nationally. So thank you for that.
Sure.
We're actually ready to move to some questions that the audience submitted. So I have some questions that were pre-submitted, and for, I think, each of the panelists, if I may, and then we'll go to some live questions. And let me start with a question that was submitted by a Tufts alumna, Karen Suva, for Kay. And I know I interrupted you before, so feel free to follow. But Karen asks, what have we learned about the impact of the youth vote? And how do we continue to grow specifically Gen Z? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the differences. You know, when we talk about young people, young voters, we talk about 18 to 29. That's really two different generations for those of us who look at things through that lens. So talk a little bit about the difference in those generations and what we've learned about the impact of young people that we should keep in mind in the future.
Thanks, Karen. That's a really good question. And, you know, Brian can probably speak to this too, but in conventional political science research, we used to see sort of an incremental increase in voter participation as young people get older, even within 20s. That doesn't seem to be the trend that we're seeing in the last couple of elections, where the 18 to 24-year-old, maybe even 18 to 21-year-old are basically caught up already to what is a 30-year-old turnout. The 18 to 24-year-old turnout was way higher than the boomers' turnout in 2018 at their same age. So they're starting to break the rule of engagement and what we knew about the political science kind of age-related pattern. By really kind of innovating how they engage each other, even when nobody expects them to vote, like they did in 2018, coming out of a horrible turnout year in 2014 as youth electorate. So we learned quite a bit this year from young people themselves about what they say about how they engage with each other, what kind of strategies they're using to motivate their peers. For instance, our research found that the young people hang out at different social media space. So if you're 25 and over and still in your 20s, you're likely to hang out in Facebook and Twitter and talk to each other. But if you're, 18 to 21-year-old, let's say, you're much more likely to produce and post things and watch things on TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat. So there are already sort of a different spaces they're cultivating, and I expect that to continue to change, sort of where they start to talk with each other and innovate how they relate to each other. So even between Facebook, Twitter versus like things like TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat, you can see one format is much more verbal and written communication, and the other is much more related to humor, lightness, and visual representation, and a lot about identity. So they do engage really differently. And you hear that from partners that we work on the ground, many of whom are 20, 22-year-old. But even recently, I just heard from one of our close partners in Minnesota, for example, who's 17 and sued the state of Minnesota for rejecting unemployment benefits for all high school students who are unemployed as a result of COVID-19 economic crisis. And they won at least $14 million in benefits for the statewide high school students. And you hear about those stories from young people and how they went through different routes. They tried to pass a law first, that didn't work out. They tried to build a network, that didn't work out. And they finally got to Attorney General Keith Ellison, who elevated the case and went in one day. You really start to see how young people are thinking about the local issues while paying attention to federal election and making sure they put the right guy in the office or right women in the office. So I think if I think about how to continue to support Gen Z's engagement and grow it, it's in those everyday local issues that young people start at, and investing in and supporting young people's voice in those engagement and their leadership is continue to be important.
Well, if I can brag on a Tufts alumnus, one of the reasons Kay knows a lot about Minnesota because Circle worked very closely with the Secretary of State in Minnesota, who's a proud jumbo. Brian, you can comment on the youth vote if you'd like, but I have a couple of questions actually about how campaigns are run. One is has been offered by a community member, Jim Vetter, who says, what can we learn from how the campaigns was conducted during the pandemic? And to what extent will the methods of virtual organizing and relational organizing continue in the future, even when physical distancing is no longer required? And another question from Catherine Sasanuma, I apologize if I messed that up, is vote by mail here to stay?
Great. Yeah. I think the campaign question is a really interesting one. And I think, I've definitely been in some meetings, listening in on meetings with, Democratic Party strategists, for example, who even now are saying, that the pandemic did hamstring a lot of what they would have done in terms of voter registration during this campaign, that was sort of where they faced the biggest challenges and where new registrations might have lagged behind what they would have been in previous campaigns. But that said, turnout is higher than it's been in like 100 years. And so, it obviously didn't make a huge difference. It didn't really cause us to sort of see a backslide in turnout or even the same level of turnout that we saw in 2016. So, in some ways it may cause us to rethink some of what we think we know about mobilizing. So, the wisdom from political science research is that face-to-face contact is the most effective in terms of mobilizing people. And yet, that was kind of off the table in a lot of ways. And yet we still saw a huge amount of mobilization this campaign. And so I think what I'm looking forward to is seeing, what some of the studies of the new tactics that were used in this election cycle, which ones worked and how did they work? Because I think it may actually end up changing how mobilization is done in the future. And then the question about vote by mail is, of course, a really, an interesting one. And, we've been on this sort of slow trend towards increasing share of the electorate who cast their votes before Election Day for the last 20 years or more. So, if you go back to 2000, about 90% of Americans voted on Election Day. If you go back to 2016, 60%. So you'd already seen quite a trend happening in terms of a smaller share of people. But I think I've seen estimates that it's going to be something like a third of voters in the cycle. So you've gone from this trend, and now, of course, you have the shock of the pandemic basically causing this huge drop off. And so you would expect that, despite what you may hear from some politicians, this election was incredibly well managed. There were not actually, for the most part, major issues with voting, with counting ballots, with long lines or processing errors or that kind of thing. We actually saw very little in terms of issues with voting. And I think, allowing this longer window for people to vote and allowing different ways for people to vote helps to mitigate a lot of those issues. And so, if you're looking at this from a purely nonpartisan perspective, it's probably in everyone's best interest to run elections this way, where you do allow for sort of no excuse early voting by mail or in person or however someone wants to vote. But of course, we've also had that now this politicization of early voting or voting by mail from the president. And so, I think it remains to be seen. My hope is that sort of that politicization is kind of forgotten in a couple of years. And because I think most Republicans are actually will look back at this election and think Trump did them no favors by basically turning off voters from voting by mail. Some people who may never have made it to the polls because they would have voted by mail and they just didn't vote on election day. And I suspect that, if I'm a Republican strategist, I'm kind of quickly going to move past sort of how Trump had sort of undermined that approach. And so if that happens, I imagine that you'll see, large shares of Americans voting by mail in future elections. Maybe not quite as high as this election cycle, but still much higher than it was in 2016.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, there are 6 states that already had voting by mail prior to this election, including some Republican strongholds like Idaho and Alaska. And I think there's a correlation between vote by mail and higher turnout. So hopefully people will catch on to that. So let me just turn.
I was going to say, in many states, Republicans are, the people who vote by mail are more Republican than Democratic in previous election cycles. So it's sort of interesting dynamic. Yeah. Sorry.
Bhaskar, Chip Glassinos, who's a Tufts alumnus, asks, why is Congress so focused on challenging the tech industry, the premier growth engine of this country? And I noticed, by the way, that today the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, ordered Facebook to divest of Instagram, if I'm not mistaken. But in any event, why is Congress seemingly intent on challenging the tech industry, if you agree with that statement?
Yeah, so I think it's not necessarily something for me to agree or disagree with. It is a fact of life. We have seen Congress take on the tech industry quite aggressively, and that aggression has only been accelerated in the year when all of us are basically reliant on tech for practically everything we do, whether it's work or school or play or whiling away the evening hours on streaming media or celebrating birthdays or sadly even saying goodbye to people that we can't see on the other side of a glass barrier. There are many legitimate reasons to be concerned about the technology sector. It has, the major players, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple have very large dominant positions in their respective industries. There are concerns about the data that they are collecting through all the digital activities that each one of us is engaging in, and that activity has just accelerated while we have been through this pandemic. There are concerns about how much the industry is doing to manage the surge of misinformation and disinformation that is coming through. And this year in particular, we've seen a convergence of forces, the pandemic, an election, all of us spending our time on screen, and the biggest amplifier of mis and disinformation being the White House itself. So, and there are many more, lots of other concerns about relating to tech. So, all legitimate reasons to take a very close look at this industry and ask the question: is this industry being responsible about the incredible power that it has, and does that require either some kind of government intervention through regulation or a breakup of the industry? So, basically, very, very good reasons for our lawmakers to take a close look at it. However, why are they doing it? It makes for good political theater. Just imagine, you have the power to haul up the richest people in the world virtually, using their own, hoisting them by their own petard, sticking them up on a screen. They look silly sitting in a suit. They look uncomfortable in a suit because they're more comfortable in a t-shirt and a hoodie. They have really bad haircuts, so that gets amplified on screen. And the lawmakers look grand sitting behind those gigantic, wooden desks, and you can see the power dynamic playing out. Who wouldn't love to see the rich and the powerful at a time when inequality is, one of the greatest, evils of our time, squirm on screen in front of us? It makes for great theater, and so there's a good reason why politicians of all stripes across the aisle have come together. This may be the only area where Republicans and Democrats agree that they would like to see Mark Zuckerberg squirm in front of them. However, the motivation for why you want to go after them may be a little bit different. So you see the Democrats tend to be a little bit more concerned about the market dominance and the monopoly power of companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon. And that has been the primary direction of their concerns and questioning. And the House Democrats spent a year plus doing a pretty thorough investigation and dropped a 450-page doorstopper of a report, which has been the basis of the FTC lawsuit that you were just talking about, Alan. And at the same time, the Republicans tend to be more focused on the fact that the big tech industry generally has been favoring the left-leaning liberal democratic voices. So they are concerned about the fact that the political messaging is viewed by the politics of the tech industry itself. So they are sleeping in the same bed, but they are dreaming different dreams. So where does this go? History suggests that it is going to take a long time to have all these hearings. It's quite possible that Joe Biden may actually pull back on, or his administration may not put their foot on the gas on these antitrust lawsuits. Some of it may be pulled back, some of it may be slowed down. And it's interesting that he has picked a vice presidential elect candidate, not a candidate, she's elect, straight out of Silicon Valley. She is very close to the industry, so she gets the industry. So there are other factors that are going to be in play. And one more notion here to keep in mind is that these lawsuits are not just coming from the federal government. Now we have state attorneys general who are also filing lawsuits, both against Google and against Facebook. The interesting thing about the Facebook lawsuit that was announced today is that it is bipartisan. Even the state of California has filed a suit against its own, darling of Facebook. So it's very interesting. And so we'll see where this goes.
Yeah. I don't know if Jeff Bezos would quite agree that he has a bad haircut. I do. Speaking of, it's a wonderful metaphor, sleeping in the same bed and dreaming different dreams. Now and again, I turn on Fox News just to see what's being said on that network. And there was last night I heard Laura Ingraham go on a rant about Mark Zuckerberg pouring money into Georgia to try to alter the outcome of the election. In any event, let me ask the last question, pre-submitted question to Amy, and then we're going to open it up to some live questions. But Amy, you mentioned something of this and talk about politicizing issues. How do we combat the problem of people politicizing the pandemic? and finding no common ground because our politics are so politicized, with the terrible outcome that has on public health?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think it's important to remember that when the pandemic first came out, we were actually quite united as a country. Polls showed that about 90% of the population were concerned or very concerned about the pandemic, and people were there was nearly universal support for the strategies to combat it as well. But then what happened? Because now we know there's a gap of about 15 percentage points between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to concern over the virus, and even a huger gap around the strategies to address it. Well, what happened was our political leaders created that gap, right? They created that, beginning with President Trump and Republicans minimizing the threat of the pandemic and the concern and advocating reopening, and the Democrats kind of coming back, fighting back, saying, they were more concerned and wanted stricter restrictions. So I think the population followed their leaders. It wasn't the reverse. And we have to remember that the population did have this universal concern, at least initially. So I think our leaders need to come together now and face this reality. And it's no longer a place to score political points. The election's over, and hopefully we can get this under control. I think one of the ways forward is to really see where we agree instead of where we disagree, and to start talking about that more instead of pointing out where we disagree. I think right now this surge in a way may help bring people together, because everyone is feeling this surge. Everyone is seeing their numbers increase. They're seeing their vacant hospital beds decrease. And so that does provide some cover for the Republican states to say, yeah, this is a serious problem and we do need to do something about it. So that may help reduce some of the polarization as well. I think as we move forward with vaccinations, my feeling is there's a lot of people who want this vaccination right now. We don't have enough vaccinations to give to all the people that do want it. So focusing on, let's get it to the people who want it first. We don't need 100% of the population to get vaccinated. We don't know exactly where that herd immunity comes in, but I think over time, as more vaccination becomes available, people will be more persuaded to get vaccinated when they feel more comfortable with the data. I don't think the polarization is the only reason why people don't want the vaccine. It's not only the Republicans that don't want the vaccine. It's people who have come out in strong support of President-elect Biden, including the Black community, who have fears about the vaccine, and rightfully so. So I think we know a lot in the public health world about how to motivate people to get vaccinations. That's something that has been worked on a lot with the flu vaccination and other vaccinations. Behavioral economics is one of the fields that has really focused on sort of these bipartisan non-mandates, more than education, but non-mandates. How do we make it easy and free and accessible? How do we create peer norms to get vaccinated? So there's lots of strategies there to work with these different populations and the different reasons why they may not want to get vaccinated. So I'm hopeful, actually, that over time we really will hit the numbers that we need to get to have herd immunity in the country, or at least to reduce some of these the huge surges that we're seeing today.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to start to take some questions from the audience that are being sent in through the chat box. And the first one is from Aaron Seaton, and it's for Brian Schaffner. I'm listening to my 15-year-old talk about young people being active, who volunteered for Mike Espy, Jamie Harrison, and Sarah Gideon. I'm sorry he didn't have a better winning percentage. He's wondering, or the 15-year-old is wondering, if the Bradley effect impacted these losses, and if you think it will impact Warnock's Georgia Senate race. And Brian can tell us what the Bradley effect is.
Yeah, so the Bradley effect is basically the idea that when people answer polls, they will basically say that they're going to vote for usually like a candidate of color, even if they're not actually going to do that. And it's so that they can basically present themselves in a good light to like a survey interviewer or whatnot. So it goes back to an old race with in which one of the candidates was African American, and basically the polls made it look like he was going to win, but he ended up not winning on election day. To be honest, there hasn't been a lot of strong evidence sort of since that election that there is in fact a Bradley effect in surveys. One example just to sort of put this into light is, in 2012, for example, Barack Obama actually underperformed his polls, or actually overperformed his polls. So he actually was polling lower than he actually ended up doing. So the polls were actually off a bit in 2012, but in that year, they actually understated the Democrats' vote share rather than overstated it. So I don't think what's happening here is a Bradley effect issue, and especially because in these states. So, for example, you mentioned Jamie Harrison. In that state, that the polls were also showing that Biden and Trump were very close in South Carolina, and ultimately that was not actually the case. That Trump actually won South Carolina fairly easily, and so I don't think that's an issue. I think the polling, and I would just one other thing I'd say is one state where the polls were actually really good in 2020 and in November was Georgia, and so I think polling a runoff election is much harder because you're not as sure who's going to vote. But the polls were actually really accurate in Georgia. They all showed a very, very neck and neck race, and that's exactly what we got. And so I suspect that those polls are pretty accurate.
Thank you. We have another audience question from Stephen Gilbert for Kay. How much of the discontent fueling polarization, both left and right, is rooted in feelings of social marginalization? People feeling they have been pushed to the fringes of their national community and deprived of the roles and respect normally accorded full members of it.
Yeah, I think this question really hits it on the nail in so many ways, right? It's on both sides. The feeling is in a way mutual. There's a lot of sense of loss on one kind of community. And one of the research projects we did identified what we call civic desert. And that happens a lot in rural areas and for people that are of lower income backgrounds and lower educational attainment backgrounds, where people feel that they had some sense of respect and belonging and mattering that's now lost to them. And on the other side, of course, the young people in particular who come from communities of color, indigenous communities, and low income communities are actually experiencing less and less likelihood that they would move up in the social ladder because of the systems we have to keep people that are low down. So that discontent does have an opportunity, though, for mobilizations. For again, in 2018 research, we found that if young people can have a political home that's belonging to a community that share value with them, that would vote together and that will take action together, that discontent about democracy or disbelief or distrust in the system actually led to more active citizenship, not just in voting, but also mobilizing together through activism in particular. So I think there is an opportunity here to really think about, now that young people have voted off Donald Trump, whom they really didn't like almost universally, what is next for them and how can the systems be set up, starting with education. Frankly, in kindergarten, can we start to really think about that kind of robust and resilient youth electorate and civic actors who can think about the bigger issues and not think about just what they're facing every day.
But those political homes that young people are looking for aren't the traditional political homes. So they're not political parties. Isn't that correct?
Correct. Yep. I think young people are really looking at different systems, potentially third parties. They've shown a little bit more support for libertarians or other third party candidates, but I think sometimes even just totally different systems, that they want to build more equitable system that serves all the people, not just those who are powerful and have economic means to participate, But I think that's a longer term agenda. And I think that's why I do get inspired by my high school coworker, in Minnesota, who won a lawsuit against the whole state. It's like a David and Goliath, and they won. And they're literally just the high school kids that were working at ice cream parlor, but like 30 hours a week so they can contribute to family income, and had to postpone their college plans, for example. And those are the young people that really will drive the systems forward in the way they want to see the future.
So I have a question from the audience, from Peter Levine to Bhaskar. Although surveys generally find foreign policy is a low priority, I have to think that being at war for nearly 20 years without success is affecting the electorate, if nothing else, by causing the mistrust that Brian Schaffner mentioned. Is there any evidence of that? How will and should Biden react?
How will he react and how should he react? The answers to those questions may be a little bit different. Let me start with the should. It is obviously a very fine balance between bringing this long campaign home, perhaps finding some kind of an unsteady equilibrium, and bringing American soldiers and others who've been deployed on the front back of the country, and also redeploy resources. So it's both human resources and capital and intellectual and technological resources to domestic issues. Biden has definitely stepped into an untended garden, and there are many storms overhead. We talk about a perfect storm. There are many storms. So his transition team has already named 4 major issues: COVID, economy, race, and climate. Foreign policy is not one of them. Foreign wars is not one of them. Of course, foreign policy and foreign wars are going to be on Biden's mind because he has been an internationalist. As I mentioned before, he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he thinks about issues at an international level. But he will need to really, really focus on the domestic situation. If I were to just compare Biden when he is going to step into office relative to his former boss, when his former boss stepped into the office, unemployment was at about 7.3%. When Biden steps in, it's going to be about 8%. The debt to national GDP when his former boss stepped in was about half of what it is now. It's 80% now. It was about 40% when President Obama started. So this is a very different picture. And this is a country that is over-leveraged, is exhausted, and has also exhausted a lot of its political and financial and military capital on other issues, bring it back home. So there is a should part which is informed by these issues. At the same time, the United States has been playing the role of leader, policeman, whatever you choose to call it, in different parts of the world. So it can't withdraw. It shouldn't withdraw. A lot of the mess that is out there in the world is the creation of the United States. So how does the United States take a more sensible and empathetic view that brings in, and here is where the committee man could be helpful, in bringing in multiple perspectives. And those multiple perspectives should not just be the perspectives of the OECD countries, the rich countries, but also the countries where we are doing these long campaigns, and bringing in those different perspectives. And of course, now it's really complicated. Do you bring in the perspective of the Taliban in Afghanistan? Probably not. So how does that all work? So the should is really complicated. And what would he do? I think he is not going to necessarily just overnight flip the switch and bring people back home. This is not a president who makes those decisions really overnight. So there is going to be a process of deliberation. There is going to be a process of bringing a multilateral approach to some of these campaigns, and that's likely to fail, I think, because every country is suffering. and none of these countries have the resources to spend on international issues. So frankly, it's a bit of a sticky wicket that the president-elect is about to bat on. Sorry for the cricketing metaphor, but hopefully it comes across.
Well, I will say that it certainly puts the Fletcher School in a position of value to the country and the world, and that you are grappling with some of these really huge issues and really have a lot to contribute to that conversation as you have this evening. So thank you. We have another question from an audience participant, from a Stephen Shapiro. This is for Amy. Do you see the Biden administration putting a priority on reshoring the production of PPE, antibiotics, and other medical equipment?
So that's a great question. I'm definitely on the PPE issue for sure. They'll be looking at making sure that PPE is more available and free of charge, or something that is just much more accessible than it is today. I mean, for healthcare workers, and I think even for the population. I think one of the problems has been that, sure, masks are cheap and people can get access to them, but if you forget it when you're going somewhere, in some places, do you not go there? They need to have these masks available everywhere. And the masks that are good and protective, so that people don't, again, making these things easy, making the default be that you wear it. Those kinds of actions can actually create a lot more compliance than even mandates at times, because mandates kind of tick people off and make us more polarized. Whereas if you just make things more available, then people are more likely to comply. So yes, I think that the Biden administration will definitely be focused on COVID, all things COVID, for the next, for the foreseeable future anyway, until we get this virus under control.
We have another question from the audience from Bruce Wilder. This is for Brian or Kay, so I'll ask each of you to comment. I'll even ask Alan to comment in a second. Can you give us your take on Texas Attorney General Paxton's effort to sue several states and the apparent support of several state attorneys general? What is the basis for the attempted suit, and what is the evidence that he claims to have? So I'm going to start with Brian, but I just want to point out, as I was channel surfing last night, I put on Fox News and I put on CNN. Both of them had comments on this lawsuit. There was a constitutional expert on Fox News that said this was a really viable issue for the Supreme Court to opine on, because it was one of the issues on which they have original jurisdiction. And then I turned to CNN, and there was no way that this was going to be addressed by the Supreme Court. And I thought that is a pretty good commentary on how people are getting their information. But that's an editorial comment from the moderator. Let me ask Brian to comment, and then for Kay to comment.
So I'll first just say I am not an election law expert, and but I do follow several on Twitter, so if that counts for anything. And I would say that there's not a lot of concern or worry being placed on this lawsuit by any of the election law experts that I know and follow. I think the obvious reason for it is what you mentioned, which is the original jurisdiction question. I remember, I think, the day after the election, in our civic studies class, I had students asking, oh, Trump just announced he's going to, appeal to the Supreme Court. And, I said, well, that's not a thing. You can't just sort of go straight to the Supreme Court. That's not how things work. But this is like the one way you could do it, is to have one state sue another. That said, the ease or the sort of abruptness with which they dismissed I believe it was the Pennsylvania case yesterday on appeal to the Supreme Court, I think is most of the indication you would need to sort of see what's probably going to happen with this case as well. The court doesn't like to generally doesn't want to get involved in election issues, and they definitely aren't going to get involved in one that's so sort of cut and dry in terms of the outcome. So I would say that I don't think this is going anywhere.
Jay?
So I'm not an election expert either, but I am a psychologist. So I worry about sort of the kind of impact throwing a lot of things in the air and then hoping that it might catch on the Twitter or go viral somewhere, because there's a lot of attempts to confuse young voters in particular. There's a lot of propaganda out there. A lot of young people are watching it, billions of views. So if those things get into these streams, it is like a little bit like a poisoned water. So if you can kind of cast this doubt on the big systems like Supreme Court or big Texas or state systems, that's enough damage. We found in older research we did that if there was an attempt to pass a law around photo ID, this is 2012, young people who had not gone to college and low-income young people and Black young people actually had shown in a model that was quite complicated, slightly less likely to vote in the 2012 election. So that shows you a little bit about how you can kind of knock somebody that's already unsure about the security of election or their ability to vote to kind of now not vote. So that's not a huge wall for a lot of our voters.
Well, that's actually a good segue to our last question, because it is about disinformation. And it's either, well, I'm going to give it to Bhaskar, because it's from Adam Bassiano. Recent data from the Digital Planet Project indicates that red states are vulnerable to disinformation in the United States. Moving forward, how can stakeholders and observers help the Republican Party take this more seriously?
Great question. And I think the Republican Party needs to take a few baby steps first. And one of those baby steps being acknowledging that dis or misinformation has been used as a lever for winning elections, at least in this round. And it's been a pretty significant lever. So the first baby step is to kind of turn away from that lever and use legitimate levers, not levers that manipulate people. So if the Republican Party, both at the national and at state levels, really want to take an ethical perspective, then they would do a few things in rooting out mis and disinformation. They would educate their constituencies in their states and cities and towns and local communities, educate them about the dangers of misinformation. And by the way, misinformation is not just pertaining to politics. We have the pandemic as well. And the worst thing that can happen with misinformation is you elect the wrong guy. In pandemic, the worst thing that happens with misinformation is that you die. The people around you die. Every day, people are dying because we are being misinformed and potentially responding to COVID inappropriately. And next year, we're going to be responding to a vaccine rollout inappropriately. And the surge on vaccine misinformation has already started, and it's only going to get worse. So the first thing that Republicans, and this is not just a Republican or Democrat issue, every political leader who has a constituency that listens to her or him needs to turn away from misinformation and educate its constituency, and then work with local media, work with community organizers to bring people up to a point where they understand how to interpret the messages that they get from the media, how to not immediately share or like a really crazy thing that I just seen posted on Facebook today. And the tendency to share or like a salacious rumor goes up when your education level goes down. It tends to go up when you move away from K's demographic towards older people who are ultimately new to the internet. So we have to recognize the demographics and the people who live in certain parts of the country who are likely to be more vulnerable to misinformation and target them first. So this is a really serious issue. It's not a political issue. We are done with the elections, at least for now. Of course, the 2024 campaign has already started on the back of a lot of misinformation. But now let's get rid of the scourge that is upon us, this COVID-19. And that is the misinformation that I hope we can really get rid of earlier rather than later.
Well, we've run out of time, but this has been an incredibly rich conversation. It is also a wonderful reflection on the scholarship and the expertise that we have at Tufts University. This is across actually 3 schools and 1 college. So we have arts and sciences, the School of Medicine, Fletcher, and Tisch College represented here. We've heard about international affairs, healthcare, youth voting, polling and campaigns. And so I really want to thank each of our panelists. You made a huge contribution. When we talk about providing information to help us deal with these really knotty problems, K-N-O-T, that this country faces, I really think that the wisdom that we have here at the university is not only capable, but is making a really significant difference in applying our knowledge and applying our expertise. So thank you. I want to thank our tech support. Phil, thank you very much. I want to thank my colleagues at Tisch College, especially Jess Burns and Shanley and Jen and everyone else for putting this together. And thanks to our audience. We had several hundred people registered, a large group of alumni, large group of community members, faculty, staff, students. We even had a large number of people in a category called Other. So thank you to all. Have a wonderful evening, and for that matter, a wonderful holiday season in spite of all of the challenges that we are dealing with. So good night. Thank you.